ticket landed face-up on Imani Webb's station like a verdict, and Gideon Thorne stood over her just long enough for the cameras to catch his smile. "Sweetheart," he said, loud enough to carry down the line of 8 gleaming stations, "I want you to know there's no shame in this. Not everybody's built for the top tier. You did well to get this far, considering." He let the word "considering" hang there. Then he reached down and straightened the collar of her borrowed chef's coat, 2 sizes too big. The cuffs rolled 3 times so they wouldn't drag in the food. He did it the way a man adjusts a thing he owns. The other 7 finalists watched. The audience in the tiered seats behind the glass watched. The line cooks plating in the open kitchen, behind them, slowed their hands to watch. Imani was 21 years old. She had grown up 4 blocks from the harbor in a part of Charleston the tourist maps left blank, raised by a grandmother who came home from the hospital cafeteria at midnight smelling of bleach and collard greens. She had never owned a knife that didn't come from a yard sale until 3 weeks ago, when the foundation mailed each finalist a single carbon steel guillotine in a velvet sleeve. She had slept with it on her nightstand like it might disappear. She looked down at the ticket Thorne had just handed her. She read it once. Her face did not move. And nobody in that bright, beautiful room understood yet that the old man in the white coat had just made the worst mistake of his life, or that the girl in the borrowed coat would make him say so himself, out loud into a microphone, in exactly 40 minutes. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what the prize was, and you have to understand the grandmother. Because both of those things were standing in that room, and Gideon Thorne had walked right past them. The prize was the Calloway Fellowship. Once a year, the Calloway Culinary Foundation pulled 8 young cooks out of a national pool of thousands and put them in the ballroom kitchen of the Beaumont Grand Hotel for a single live final. The winner got a full ride to the Institute in Hyde Park, a 2-year paid apprenticeship under a name chef, and a bronze medallion set into the marble floor of the Beaumont lobby, where it would stay until the building came down. In 31 years of the fellowship, the medallion had never carried a name from south of Broad Street. It had certainly never carried a name like Imani's. She had qualified on her food alone. There was no recommendation letter, because the only chefs who knew her were the ones who'd let her wash dishes for cash off the books, and none of them had stationery. She'd cooked her qualifying round in the back of a church fellowship hall on a residential stove with a borrowed immersion circulator, and the tape of it had made one of the regional judges go quiet for a full minute before she pressed advance. Her grandmother's name was Imani Webb. She was 68. She sat in the front row of the audience that morning in a church dress the color of dark plums, a dress she had ironed at 5 in the morning, her good purse held in her lap with both hands. She had taken 3 buses to be there. In the purse, wrapped in a paper napkin, was a slice of Benet wafer cake she'd baked the night before, because Imani forgot to eat when she was nervous and somebody had to remember for her. The rain had told her one thing at the elevator, the same thing she always said, the thing that had carried the girl through every cold morning of her short life. "You already make me proud, baby, that part's done. Now go on and cook." Then she'd let go of her hand and let the doors close. The room itself had 2 halves, the way these things always do. There was the kitchen floor, 8 stations under hot lights, ringed by cameras on long jib arms. And there was the audience gallery behind a wall of glass, 300 people. Food writers, donors in linen suits, the Beaumont's owners, a critic from the Charleston Courier named Patrice Vaughn with a notebook already open on her knee. Above the whole floor hung 4 enormous screens. The plan was simple, and the foundation had bragged about it in the press kit. Total transparency. Every station would be filmed in close-up and projected live, knife to plate, so the gallery and the stream could judge alongside the panel. No secrets, no favorites. But the screens did not go live the moment the cooks were seated. There was a gap, a 5-minute window between when the tickets were handed out and when the broadcast switched from the host's introduction to the kitchen feed. 5 minutes when no camera was pointed at any station in particular. 5 minutes nobody outside that floor could see. Gideon Thorne had used those 5 minutes carefully. You should know about Thorne. He was 58, head judge, the most famous chef the Low Country had ever produced. His restaurant, Verin, had a Michelin star before half the room was born. His face was on a line of cast iron pans sold in airports. the dish that built him, the dish that had been on the cover of 3 magazines and tattooed onto the city's idea of itself, was a single bowl of soup, a bene volute with blue crab, smoked toasted sesame folded into a silk so fine the critics had spent 30 years trying to describe the texture without sounding like they were in love. He guarded the method the way other men guard a will. He had said in more than one interview that the velouté came to him one night in 1991, in the early days of Varin, like a gift from the marsh itself. That was a lie, and the only 2 people alive who knew it were in the building. One of them was about to cook. The other was holding a slice of cake in a paper napkin in the front row. When Thorne had been handed the master sheet that morning, the sheet that assigned each finalist a dish to execute from a sealed ticket, he had done a small thing with his pen in those unwatched 5 minutes. The other 7 cooks drew approachable modern plates. Seared scallop with a pea puree, a clean ceviche, a roast chicken, of all things, the kind of dish a confident young cook could nail in their sleep. He had pulled Imani's ticket and replaced it with one of his own making. Her ticket read, Ben Volute, blue crab, classic execution, 40 minutes. It was the velouté, his velouté, a dish that took line cooks at Varin 2 years to be allowed to touch, that broke under heat, that split if you breathed on it wrong, that required an emulsion most people never learned in a lifetime. He had handed a 21-year-old self-taught cook from a church kitchen the single hardest plate in the building and given her 2/3 the time anyone sane would need on a live broadcast in front of the woman who'd raised her. He was certain she would panic. He was certain the silk would break, the crab would weep water, the bowl would come up gray and curdled and sad, and the whole watching world would see a poor girl in over her head, the way poor girls always were. And the brave story would die quietly, and the medallion would go to someone with the right last name, and Gideon Thorne would shake her hand on the way out and say, "You should be proud. You really should, and mean none of it." He was wrong about one thing, and it was the only thing that mattered. The Imani Webb had been making that velouté since she was 9 years old. She read the ticket a second time. She set it down. She did not raise her hand. She did not look toward the judges' table, where Thorne had already gone to take his seat between a critic named Owen Brandt and a chef named Delphine Arsenault. She looked at her station, the crab she'd been given, the ben seed, the butter, the fish stock, the small copper pot. She looked at her hands, and then, very quietly, almost to herself, she smiled. Thorne saw the smile from the judges' table and read it as a girl about to cry. He leaned over to Brandt and murmured something, and the 2 of them laughed behind their water glasses. The smile was not fear. The smile was recognition. Imani had not eaten Thorne's famous velouté in a restaurant. She had never been able to afford a table at Varin in her life. She had grown up eating that exact soup at her grandmother's stove on Sunday afternoons out of a chipped bowl with cornbread, and Lorraine had taught her the method one slow step at a time, and there was a step in it, one small turn of the wrist with the toasted bene, that no recipe in any magazine had ever printed, because the man who put his name on the soup had never known it was the part that made it work. The clock on the wall read 9018. The host's voice rose in the gallery. The screens flickered. 4 red dots bloomed above 4 cameras. The feed went live. 300 people leaned forward in their chairs. In the front row, Lorraine Webb gripped her purse until the leather creaked. And on the big screen, larger than life, the city of Charleston watched a girl in a coat too big for her toast, a handful of sesame seeds in a dry copper pot, and leaned down to smell the smoke. What does a person do when the most powerful man in the room has just tried to drown her in public and dressed it up as a kindness? She did not move fast. That was the first thing, and the gallery noticed it before they understood it. The other 7 cooks were already a blur, knives flashing, pans roaring, the panic of 40 minutes driving them into motion. Imani stood still over her bene, turning the seeds with a wooden spoon, her ear cocked toward the pot like she was listening to it. For 90 seconds she didn't pick up a knife. A woman in the 3rd row of the gallery, the aunt of another finalist, said to her sister, not quietly enough, "There, see?" She froze. "I told you. They get them in the door and then they fold." Lorraine heard it. She did not turn around. She did not breathe. But Imani wasn't frozen. She was waiting for the Benny to tell her it was ready, because her grandmother had taught her that the seed will go from nutty to bitter in the space of 3 seconds, and the only way to catch it is to stop doing everything else and pay attention to one thing. You can't rush the part that matters, the rain used to say, stirring with one hand and braiding Imani's hair with the other. Everything else you can rush. Not that. By minute 3, the Benny was right and Imani moved. After that, the gallery couldn't look away, and most of them couldn't have told you why. They didn't know what a velouté was. They couldn't read a route was. They couldn't read a roost the way a chef could. But they could see a pair of hands that had clearly done this 10,000 times. And they could feel, the way you feel weather coming, that something on the screen did not match the story they'd been told about the girl. The crap was picked clean and fast, shell flicked into the bin without a glance. The stock went on, the butter went in cold, cube by cube, off the heat, each one whisked to nothing before the next, the patience of it almost unbearable to watch with a clock running. At the judge's table, Delphine Arsenault set down her pen. She was a slight woman with silver locks and 40 years on the line, and she had been hired to judge food, and she knew what she was looking at. She leaned toward Owen Brandt and said, very low, "Is she doing the velouté? The velouté?" Brandt didn't answer. He was looking at his own copy of the master assignment sheet, and his eyebrows had climbed toward his hairline, because the sheet in front of him said Station 4 was meant to be cooking a summer vegetable plate, and Station 4 was Imani Webb, and Station 4 was very clearly building Gideon Thorne's signature soup from the floor up. He made a small mark on the sheet. He did not say anything yet. Beside him, Thorne was watching the girl's hands and the easy patience in them, and for the first time that morning, the smile slipped off his face entirely. By minute 12, Imani raised her hand. The floor manager hurried over. Thorne got up from the table before he could be summoned, crossing the kitchen with the long, unbothered stride of a man who owns the building. "Problem, sweetheart," he said. "Too much for you? You can step away, no shame in it. We can plate what you've got." She spoke quietly, but the live mics caught every word and they carried it up to the gallery and out across the stream. "No problem, chef. I just wanted to ask which finish you'd like." She nodded at the pot. "The recipe most people print finishes the velouté with a butter mountain, strains it twice. But that version always breaks a little under the lights. There's an older way. You toast the last of the bene separate, almost to smoke, and you temper it off the heat at the very end, and it holds the silk and it doesn't break. It takes longer, it's harder, but it's the way it's supposed to be done." She looked up at him, perfectly polite. "I can do it either way, chef. Which would you like?" For a fraction of a second, Gideon Thorne's face did a thing it had not done in 20 years. It went blank. Because there was no older way in any recipe he had ever published. There was no separate toast, no off-heat temper in any interview, any cookbook, any class he had ever taught for $2,000 a seat. He had built his entire mythology on a method that came to him in 1991, and a 21-year-old he had never met had just described out loud on a live broadcast the one secret step he had spent 30 years pretending didn't exist, because the truth was he never understood why it worked. He had only known that the soup was perfect on the nights one particular prep cook stayed late to finish it, and gray and lifeless on the nights she didn't, and he had never once asked her name to the people who mattered. He recovered. Men like him always recover, the first time. "Just cook it the way it's printed," he said, the warmth gone out of his voice. "We don't need a history lesson." "Yes, chef," Imani said. And then she did it the older way anyway, because the older way was the right way, and she had not come all this distance on 3 buses and a borrowed coat to make a worse soup to flatter a man who tried to ruin her. She set a second small pan on the flame and toasted the last spoonful of ben until the kitchen filled with the smell of it, and the camera caught the smoke curling up past her face, and in the front row, Lorraine Webb closed her eyes, because she knew that smell better than she knew her own heartbeat. Up in the gallery, Patrice Fawn, the critic, wrote 4 words in her notebook and circled them twice. She knows the method. By minute 18, the velouté was poured, and even on the screen, even to people who had never tasted it, it was beautiful, pale gold, glossy, unbroken, the crab arranged on top like something that had grown there. Imani set the bowl down at the edge of her station and stepped back and folded her hands and waited. She'd finished with 22 minutes to spare. The clock on the wall read 9:36. The gallery was silent. Now hold there a second. Look at what's on that screen. A self-taught girl from a forgotten part of the city handed an impossible dish by a man twice her age who wanted to watch her drown, just made his signature soup better than he ever printed it on live television with half the time, and called out a secret he never told a soul. And the man who set the trap is sitting at the judge's table sweating through a coat that cost more than her grandmother makes in a month. If you've ever been handed the wrong test on purpose, you already know there's a second half to this. You always have to win it twice. So did she. Because before we find out what Gideon Thorne did next, you have to understand how a poor girl from Charleston knew a soup that the most famous chef in the South thought was his alone. And to understand that, you have to go back, the way the best stories always make you go back, before the lights, before the prize, to a kitchen with a screen door and a window fan in the summer of a long time ago. Imani Webb came to Charleston at 17 from a sea island where her family had cooked Gullah food for 4 generations, where Ben wasn't a garnish but a foundation, brought across an ocean by people who'd carried the seeds in their hair so the new world couldn't take everything. She got work in restaurant kitchens because that was the work a black woman could get, and she was good, and being good got her noticed by a young chef named Gideon Thorne, who was opening a place on a side street and needed someone who could actually cook while he charmed the dining room. She ran his prep. She ran his line when he was out front. And the night Varine's velouté was born, it was Lorraine who stood at the stove at 11 o'clock and finished the soup the way her own grandmother had finished it, with the smoke-toasted Ben tempered off the heat, because the version Thorne had been making split every single time, and he'd thrown up his hands and gone to flirt with the food writers, and she fixed it quietly, the way she fixed everything, and the writers tasted it and wept. And the next morning Gideon Thorne told the Post and Courier that the dish had come to him in a dream. He never put her name on a menu. He paid her in cash. When she got pregnant and asked for 2 weeks, he replaced her. And when she came back, the door was locked and the soup on the new menu was almost right and never quite, and only she ever knew why. She raised her daughter, and when her daughter was gone too soon, she raised her daughter's child, and she did it on a cafeteria salary and church charity and stubbornness, and on Sunday afternoons when the week's bills were stacked on the counter unpaid. She made that velouté for a wide-eyed little girl named Imani, not because they could afford crab, but because once a month she could, and she taught the child the method one slow step at a time. The bend, the patience, the wrist. This is ours, she'd say. Don't let anybody tell you different. This soup is older than that man's whole life. She kept the original recipe in her own hand on an index card gone soft and brown at the edges, dated and signed the way her grandmother had taught her to sign her work, because a woman whose work keeps getting taken learns to write her name on it. The card was in Imani Webb's good purse, in the front row, wrapped behind a slice of cake. She hadn't planned to use it. She brought it because she brought it everywhere, the way some people carry a photograph. But 2 nights before the final, Imani had sat at the kitchen table after midnight, unable to sleep, and said, "Grandma, that man's going to try something. I can feel it." And Lorraine had not said, "Don't be silly." She had looked at her granddaughter for a long moment, and then she'd gotten up and made coffee, and she'd gone to the drawer and taken out the soft brown card and slid it across the table. "Then carry your name with you," she'd said, "and know how to use it." Now back in the ballroom kitchen at minute 18 of 40, with a perfect bowl of velouté cooling on her station, and the man who tried to break her sitting pale at the judge's table, Gideon Thorne stood up. He could have let it go. The smart play, the survivor's play, would have been to score the soup low on some invented technicality and move on. But pride is a stupid animal, and Thorne had been the most important man in every room he entered for 30 years, and he could not stand to lose to a child in a borrowed coat in front of the people who fed his legend. So he walked to the front of the floor, to the podium with the live mic, and he smiled at the gallery, and he turned a disaster into an ultimatum. "What a performance," he said smoothly. "Really, but I think the room deserves certainty. Anyone can rehearse one bowl. Anyone can get lucky once." He let his gaze fall on Imani. So I'm going to offer Miss Webb a chance to prove it isn't a fluke. Right here, in front of all of you. She'll cook the velouté again, from scratch, alone, with me watching every step, in 20 minutes. If she can do it twice, she's earned every word of praise. If she can't, he's spread his hands magnanimous, lethal. Well, then we'll all understand what we saw. It was vicious and it was clever. If she refused, tomorrow's story wrote itself. Finalist declines to defend her dish. Withdraws. The brave girl becomes the girl who couldn't take the heat. If she agreed, she handed Thorne everything. The time, the terms, the right to stand at her shoulder and rattle her in front of the only person on earth she couldn't bear to disappoint. Delphine Arsenault's jaw tightened. The Foundation's director half rose from his seat. But the rules allowed it, and Thorne knew the rules, and he stood at that podium waiting for the girl to break, because in his whole long life no one ever had refused to play a game he'd rigged. Dr. Margaret Calloway, the Foundation chair, an old woman with a spine like rebar, turned to Imani. "You don't have to do this," she said. "Say the word and we move on. The choice is yours." Imani looked at her. She looked at the velouté she'd already made, perfect, and ignored. She looked at the man at the podium, so sure of himself. And then she looked at the front row, and a woman in a plum dress holding a purse in both hands. A 20-minute pause was called so the station could be reset. Imani was led to a small holding room off the kitchen, and Lorraine was allowed in, and the door closed, and for the first time all morning the girl let her shoulders drop. "Grandma," she said, "what if I lose?" Lorraine set her purse on the little table and opened it and took out the slice of Ben cake in its napkin and put it in Imani's hand the way she had when the girl was small. "Eat that. You haven't had a thing since 5. She waited until Imani took a bite. "Now hear me, you did not lose anything today. You walked in here on your own 2 feet, and you made our soup the right way in front of God and everybody, and that man knows it, and that's why he's out there shaking. The medallion, the school, that's their business to give. The cooking was yours to do, and you did it. Whatever happens past that door doesn't touch the part that's already done." Imani swallowed. "He's going to make me do something he thinks I can't. That's why he set it up. I know. He's going to pick the velouté again because he thinks the secret step is his, and I only know it by luck." Lorraine was quiet a moment. Then she reached into the purse and took out the soft brown index card dated 1991 and laid it on the table between them, her own name written across the bottom in careful round letters. "When a man is afraid," she said, "he reaches for the thing he thinks he's best at, the thing he put his name on." She tapped the card. "But he put his name on the wrong soup, baby, always did. So when he reaches for it," she smiled, and there were 30 years in that smile. "You hand him mine." Imani looked at the card for a long time. Then she folded the napkin closed, and she stood up, and she took her grandmother's hand, and the two of them walked out of the holding room side by side, not one behind the other. In the hallway, Gideon Thorne stood with 2 donors in summer linen, telling some story with his hands, and when he saw the girl coming, he turned his back on her deliberately and laughed at something one of the men said. He did not look at her grandmother. He had never once in 30 years looked at her grandmother. He should have. When the floor reset, the gallery was fuller than before. Word had run through the hotel. Cooks from the Beaumont's own kitchen had come up to stand along the back wall. 2 more reporters had slipped into the gallery. People stood in the aisles. Imani stepped up to her station. The fresh ingredients were laid out. The clock was set to 20 minutes. Thorne took his place at her shoulder, close enough to be felt, and the floor manager raised a hand. But before the hand came down, Imani turned and faced the gallery. She spoke quietly, and the room went so still that the mics didn't have to strain. "Before I start, Chef, I'd like one condition. Same as you asked for fairness, I'll ask for it too. If I make this soup again the way I just made it, then this dish goes in the record under its real name. The right one, that's all." Thorne's mouth went tight. To refuse would look like exactly what it was. "We'll discuss the record after," he said. "No, Chef." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "We'll agree now, in front of everyone, or I won't cook, because this isn't your soup." A sound moved through the gallery. Not a gasp and not a laugh. Something in between. This veloute, Imani said, turning to the room, wasn't invented in 1991 in a dream. It's a gula dish. Benny came over with my grandmother's people across the water, and her grandmother cooked it, and her grandmother before that, and the step that makes it work, the smoked toast and the off-heat temper, the step Chef Thorne has never printed in any book, because he never knew where it came from. That step has a name and a hand behind it. She reached into the pocket of her too-big coat and drew out the soft brown card, and she held it up. Her name is Lorraine Webb. She finished the soup at Vereen the night the critics fell in love with it. She wrote it down in 1991, and she signed it, because she'd already learned what happens to a woman whose work keeps getting taken. And she is sitting right there in the front row in the plum dress with cake in her purse, because she came on 3 buses to watch her granddaughter cook our food in a room that never thought either one of us belonged in it. 300 faces turned, all at once, toward a small woman in a front row seat who had gone very still with both hands pressed to her mouth. Then Imani turned back to the stove, and she picked up the spoon, and she cooked. She cooked it talking quietly to herself, the way she had at 9, the way kids do when the work is the only thing in the world. She built the stock, picked the crab, mounted the butter cube by cube, and at the end she toasted the last of the ben in a separate pan until it smoked, and she pulled it off the heat and tempered it in slow, and the silk held, gold and glossy and unbroken, and she did it in 14 minutes. And when she set the bowl down, she had 6 minutes left on the clock. Delphine Arsenault stood up at the judge's table. She did not look at Thorne. She spoke to the room. For the record, she said, as a judge of this competition, I will state plainly that Miss Webb's execution of this dish is the finest I have seen in my career, and that the method she describes is correct, and that I, for one, have always wondered why Chef Thorne's printed recipe never quite worked at home. A nervous ripple of laughter. She did not smile. Chef Thorne, into the microphone, please. Is her soup correct? The hall held its breath. Thorne's jaw worked. He looked at the donors in linen who would not meet his eye now. He looked at the reporter, Patrice Vaughn, pen up, recording. He looked at the bowl, perfect, and at the soft brown card in the girl's raised hand. It's correct, he said. Louder, chef, for the record. He leaned toward the mic. His voice came out flat and dead. It's correct, all of it. The gallery did not cheer. They exhaled, 300 people letting go of one long breath at once. In the front row, Lorraine Webb bent forward over her purse and shook. And it might have ended there, with a confession and a perfect bowl, except that while Thorne was saying those words into the microphone, the foundation chair was reading something on her phone, an email that had come in at 8:51 that morning and sat unopened because she'd had no reason to open it. It was from a line cook named Tobias Reese, 20 years old, who had been setting up the floor before dawn and had seen Chef Thorne stand over Station 4 in the dark and switch the tickets, and who had filmed it on his phone from the prep alcove because something about it sat wrong in his chest, and who had then been too scared to send it to anyone but the address on the Foundation's website, with 3 words in the subject line, "Please watch this." Dr. Calloway watched it twice. Then she stood and asked for the floor and walked to the podium with her phone in her hand, and the room went quiet a 3rd time. At 8:51 this morning, she said, the Foundation received a video from a member of the Beaumont kitchen staff. I have just watched it. I'm going to describe what it shows, and then we will be done here. She set the phone on the podium. It shows the head judge of this competition, during the camera blackout, removing the assigned ticket from one finalist's station and replacing it with a ticket in his own writing. The dish he wrote was his own signature veloute. The time he allotted was 40 minutes. She let that sit. He did this, I believe, expecting that finalist to fail. She did not editorialize. She didn't have to. The room finished a sentence in 300 heads at once. What happened after that took about 2 minutes. The Foundation board voted on the floor, by show of hands, to award the Calloway Fellowship to Imani Webb. They voted to remove Gideon Thorne from any future role with the Foundation, permanently. The Beaumont's owner, sitting in the 3rd row, was already on his phone to his lawyers about a man whose pans were sold under the hotel's name. And Dr. Duong, Calloway announced one more thing, in a voice that carried clean to the back wall the veloute on Vereen's menu, and in the Foundation's records would from that day forward be credited as it should have been, from the start, to Lorraine Webb of the Charleston Sea Islands, originator. Gideon Thorne left through the side door before she finished the sentence. The donors he'd been laughing with 20 minutes earlier watched him go and didn't rise. The cruelest thing the room did was the kindest thing it could do for the girl. It kept its eyes on her and gave him nothing, not even a glare, on his way out into the rest of his small life. Dr. Calloway called Imani to the podium. She had to bring the little step stool. The coat was still too big in the shoulders. She still had the napkin of cake in one hand, and she did not put it down. She leaned to the mic, and she found her grandmother in the front row. "I didn't beat anybody today," she said. "I just cooked our soup the way I was taught." She took a breath. "My grandmother rode 3 buses this morning to be here. She raised me on a cafeteria check and Sunday afternoons. She's been making this dish since before that man was famous off it, and she never got her name on a single thing. So if you're going to clap for somebody in this room," her voice caught and she let it, "clap for her. The lady in the plum dress. Front row, she's got cake in her bag." The hall stood, all 300 of them, the donors and the writers and the line cooks along the back wall, and they turned toward the front row and they kept clapping, and Lorraine Webb shook her head and waved them down, and they would not be waved down, and at last, slowly, with one hand on the seat back in front of her and the other still clutching that good purse, she stood up too. The Courier photographer was already on his knee in the aisle, and the picture he took that morning ran on the front page 2 days later, above the fold. And it was not a picture of the girl. It was a picture of an old woman in a plum dress, standing, both hands pressed to her mouth, 30 years arriving all at once on her face. The caption was 3 words, her name finally. "So that's where I'd like to leave you, if you'll let me. Not on the medallion they set into the Beaumont floor that fall, the one that reads Webb in bronze, where no name like it had ever been. Not even on the soup, that they make it the right way now, with the smoked toast and the off-heat temper, the way it was always meant to be made. I'd like to leave you on the cake and the napkin, on a woman who came home at midnight smelling of bleach for 40 years and still found it in herself to make a child believe that what they carried was worth carrying, on the simple, stubborn fact of the thing this world keeps trying to take from people, their work, their name, their place at the table, has a way of coming back around when somebody refuses to let it go. The talent didn't grow under those bright lights. They grew in a kitchen with a window fan. On the Sundays, they could just barely afford the crab. Somebody out there is at a stove right now, or a desk or a workbench, doing a thing they were told they had no business doing in a room that wasn't built for them. If that's you, finish the part that matters and let the rest rush by. And if there's somebody behind you who taught you what you know and never got their name on it, say it out loud while they can still hear you. Because the work was always yours. They only ever forgot to write it down. The part I can't shake is the cake in the napkin. Not the bronze medallion they set into the Beaumont floor, not the bowl of Valanche glowing gold on a giant screen, a slice of Benny cake, an old woman wrapped at midnight because her granddaughter forgot to eat when she was scared, and somebody had to remember for her. That's where the whole thing actually lived. I think about why it ended the way it did, and it wasn't luck. Gideon Thorne built 30 years of fame on a soup he never understood, taken from a woman whose name he wouldn't say. You can do that for a long time. You can do it your whole life. But a thing built on a stolen foundation is only ever waiting for the right person to walk in and tap the wall. He handed Imani his hardest dish to break her, and it turned out he'd handed her the one thing in that room she knew better than he did, because it had been hers all along. Cause and effect. You can't sabotage someone with their own inheritance. What got her through, I keep deciding, was 3 things, and none of them was talent by itself. There was the plain decency of it, the refusal to make a worse soup just to flatter a cruel man, the insistence that her grandmother's name go in the record before she'd cook a single drop. There was the clear-eyed reading of the trap, the patience to wait 90 seconds for the beignet instead of panicking like everyone expected, the wisdom to know which version of the truth the room couldn't ignore. And under all of it there was the sheer wear of it, the rain coming home smelling of bleach for 40 years. Sundays they could just barely afford the crab, a girl practicing a dish 10,000 times in a kitchen with a window fan. The grit didn't grow under the lights. It grew in the long, unglamorous dark where nobody was clapping yet. I don't think any of us get to choose whether the world underestimates us. Imani didn't. Lorraine didn't. What you get to choose is whether you're ready when the room finally turns to look. You build the character that won't cut a corner even when nobody's watching. You sharpen the mind that sees the trap a beat before it closes. You put in the ears that feel like they're going nowhere, because one morning they all arrive at once on your grandmother's face in a front row seat. So if you're at some stove of your own tonight, doing the work in a place that wasn't built for you, finish the part that matters and let the rest rush by. And if somebody taught you everything you know and never got their name on it, say it out loud while they can still hear you. The work was always yours. They only forgot to write it down.